Today, we are joined by Dr. Andrew Yeo, a senior researcher at the Brookings Institution, who is very famous both in South Korea and in the United States. He's a real specialist in East Asian relations and also alliance issue, also North Korean politics and all these security issues. Let me start by asking a very general question. Now that we are a couple of weeks past the 2024 US presidential election, in which former President Donald Trump was elected. So I want to ask you about the general atmosphere and reaction in the United States among the political experts and also from the public, how they respond to Trump's return to the White House and your own view of the election results and what they may signal for the next 4 years.
Thanks, Professor Chun, for that question. And it's a pleasure to be back to talk to you and about the elections. And as you mentioned, it's a historic election in some ways. And the dust is now settling, but things are moving very fast paced as President-elect Donald Trump selects his cabinet officials. Let me just say a few positive things. It was a free and fair election. We saw that turnout was high. It was above 60%. So whether you're half the country that's very upsetting or half the country that's elated that Trump was elected, you can say that democracy is working, at least electoral democracy. But democracy and liberalism don't necessarily coincide all the time. So that's where there's some concerns. Another positive thing, and this is a very low bar, is that there wasn't any violence. I kid you not that near the White House, some of the buildings, some of the businesses, they had boarded up the windows because they were preparing for possible violence. But that didn't happen, and the Democrats conceded. And so that leads to the surprise for most Americans, at least for those who had supported Harris. It was how convincingly President-elect Trump had won. I didn't think the election would be called until at least a day or two later, but by midnight of election night, it was pretty clear where things were heading. And of course, at the end, Trump won 312 electoral votes to Harris's 216. But even the popular vote, we saw that Trump had about 3 million more votes for him than Harris. So the real surprising thing is the swing state. You assume that Harris would win, two or three, but all of them went to the Republican candidate, Donald Trump. So that was a big surprise. Now, I'll let the domestic political experts, continue to analyze why the vote swung so much in favor for Trump. Of course, a lot of it they say about inflation and general dissatisfaction with the Biden administration. But for whatever the reasons, I think there's real implications both domestically and in terms of US foreign policy. And those things are interrelated. And I mentioned that there's concerns about democracy in the US, or actually the shift towards more illiberal practices, only because Trump has repeatedly said that he would go after opponents or people who don't appear loyal or people who had criticized him or investigated him. You think about the United States being an example for democracy. We see the pendulum swinging back. So it leads to real questions then about US leadership on the global stage. If our internal politics is a mess, if democracy is made a mockery by President Trump, then how does that affect the United States is able to lead on the global stage? That might not even be a question for Trump. At times, he seems to not really care about what's happening in other parts of the world. He'll say, leave it to the countries in the region to figure out. So there's that connection between domestic politics and foreign policy. So let me just start with some broad implications for foreign policy and then move our way towards the Indo-Pacific. And because I know many of the followers of this program are interested in North Korea and the region. There's a paradox about Trump. On one hand, we actually do know him. He's been clear and consistent on certain positions like tariffs, immigration, deregulation, and climate. We've seen his first administration. We followed him He was always in the news, even during the Biden administration. So we have a pretty good sense of who he is and what kind of policy positions he takes. We also know that he's very transactional in his thinking. It's always about a give and take or striking some kind of bargain. But there's also a lot of uncertainty. That's the paradox because he acts on a whim. He often contradicts himself, which leads to anxiety, uncertainty. International politics, certainty is really important for global governance. We need to have transparency, and that's something that Trump doesn't necessarily give. So when we turn to some of the key foreign policy issues, what might that look like in the first year of the Trump administration? He's going to inherit two major conflicts, one between Ukraine and Russia, the other in the Middle East with Israel, Hamas. My sense is that Ukraine will be his biggest focus just because he's mentioned it so much. He's repeatedly said that he's going to end the war in 24 hours. I think he'll make an effort to try to mediate between Zelensky and Putin. He'll probably try to get Zelensky to come to negotiating table to stop the fighting. How successful he'll be, that's really hard to say. My own sense is that he's going to run into a lot of trouble because I think Putin is very committed to fighting this war. He has about one-fifth of Ukraine, but I'm not sure if he really wants to stop there if he sees a clear military advantage. And certainly, if he can't sustain what he gained from the 2022 invasion, Putin's going to really lose face. So he has to take some territory from Ukraine. But for Zelensky, his goal is to not lose any territory. But I think that goal is going to be very difficult to meet. And so I don't see how Trump is going to persuade um, either party to come to negotiations. Now, he could say, well, if Ukraine gives up some of its territory to Russia, but they guarantee Ukraine's security by allowing NATO membership, maybe that might be one possibility, but that's also not something that Putin would permit. So the issue here is, can Trump make a deal? Is it a deal that's going to leave a lasting peace? I'm afraid that if some deal is struck, it won't be one that anyone is really satisfied with, and there could be another war that erupts down the road. So that's Ukraine. I think he'll try to end the war, but I'm skeptical about how successful he can be. On the Middle East, I'm actually more optimistic, in part because I think Trump has more influence over Israel and Netanyahu than Biden. And if you're Hamas, I'd be worried if Trump comes in because he's probably going to give Israel more weapons, political support, and cover than Biden has. But Trump also has very good relations with a lot of Arab countries, Saudi Arabia, UAE, with Qatar. I mean, he doesn't like Iran. So that's also bad news for Hamas. But because he might be able to work with some of the Arab countries, they might be able to strike a deal. If Hamas recognizes that its position is not going to look any better, there might be some resolution. My assumption is that Israel is going to push really hard before Trump comes into office and then maybe allow Trump to come in and take the credit for some kind of deal. That leaves us with the Indo-Pacific, and I think that's where I think a lot of interest lies for the listeners here. Of all the regions, I would say that Trump will be most consistent with Biden, in large because of his hawkish views on China. And this is not just Trump, it's much of the Republican Party. We see this with some of his cabinet picks, Secretary of State Marco Rubio, National Security Advisor Chris Waltz. These people are known to be pretty hawkish when it comes to China. They also advocate for human rights, especially Rubio on the Xinjiang issue. So if that's the direction that Trump is going to go, then I do think he will look at longer game for the Indo-Pacific. But Trump cannot make America great, sustain American power in the region without alliances or a network that includes South Korea, Japan, Taiwan. He'll probably try to impose tariffs. He hasn't really said that much about economic security. It's been mostly about tariffs. That's going to create friction with alliances. But in the broader picture, this concern with China means that to some degree, he's going to need US force presence. He's going to need to work with allies to coordinate uh, export controls and other measures to slow down China's technology growth. He's going to need cooperation. So it may look messy because of his, transnational nature, but I bet there's going to be more consistency with alliances in Asia than in other parts of the world.
Okay, great. Uh, you covered a lot of issues. Can I go back to the Ukraine, Middle East issue? When President Trump talks about peace through strength, it seems to me he implies some kind of global leadership still, some kind of internationalism with a military power. But he also adopts the rhetoric of isolationism, great confusion between illiberal hegemony or global leadership versus isolationism. You are an expert about strategic narrative. Can you some analysis on that?
This is, I think, the paradox that Trump has. At times, he sounds like Reagan in some sense. In fact,
Mm.
uh, there's a book, Matt Kroenig tries to make the case that Trump is more like Reagan than you think. Peace through strength, strong, powerful military. Most likely the defense budget is going to go up under Trump. But at other times, he's telling allies to fend for themselves. He doesn't want to support NATO, or he tells NATO countries, you fork up your own resources. That's uncertainty because he has these two different narratives. One day he may look like Reagan, conservative internationalist advocate, and the next day he might sound like he's isolation. He wants his focus inward and deal with the immigration problem and not with global issues. On Ukraine issue, I think he's been more consistent. He's been saying over and over, why should we support Ukraine? It's not because he dislikes Zelensky or Ukraine necessarily. He just thinks that NATO needs to do more, that this is really in Europe's theater, and it's Europe that is facing the largest threat from Russia. Even the NATO Secretary General has conceded that the Europeans, NATO members can contribute more. Of course, they don't want the US to pull back. They want the US to continue contributing as NATO steps up, but he doesn't necessarily want to be leading in center when it comes to the Ukraine.
Mhm,
Uh,
mhm,
the Middle East may be different. A lot of it is about business deals with the
mhm,
Saudis or the Emiratis, like getting energy deals in place. And we saw in the first Trump administration with the Abraham Accords, it was close to getting a deal between the Saudis and the Israelis. The Arab countries, Saudi Arabia in particular, they don't have any issues with him being illiberal. So I
mhm,
think he could actually get along quite well. So I think he will be involved, but not in the sense of putting a lot of troops and, American power into the Middle East, but I think he's going to play more of a broker role. But then it's the Indo-Pacific where, in some ways, there's more questions. I think he recognizes China as a threat, long-term competition. And like I said, the leaders, much of his party, kind of the mainstream Republican, that looks like he's shying away from those in the first administration. Matt Pottinger has already, passed over Mike Pompeo for any role. And he
mhm,
said Pompeo is not going to have any role. The second Secretary of State in his first administration. These are all people who had conservative internationalist position.
okay.
Now, Rubio and Waltz, I think, they'll come off as much more hawkish, but I don't know if that's what Trump would necessarily agree to. And Trump at some point may want to make some kind of deal with Xi Jinping. So in some ways, I think the Indo-Pacific is the region that matters most in the long term, but it's the one where we may not have as much clarity because he talks about tariffs, reducing troops on the Korean Peninsula. But then he mentions that we need to defeat China. That's where we have these inconsistencies.
Mhm, mhm. That's a very important point. I am not sure if President Trump will approach China issue from a purely economic nationalist perspective or from a more hegemonic military pacing threat perspective.
Mhm.
If the latter, then there should be some comprehensive approach to China, put on more emphasis on alliance and multi and unilateral mechanisms that the Biden administration has pursued, such as Quad and AUKUS. But if he doesn't have that comprehensive view about hegemonic competition, he will not think about economic security in general, but from a trade surplus.
That's a very good way of framing the narratives on China, whether it's economic nationalism, focusing on tariffs, trade deficit, or that China's stealing American jobs that dominates, or is it one about hegemonic competition,
Mhm.
whether the US has to stay out on top? That's where you go back to the Reagan view of global politics, and
Right.
you do see US leadership and military power, peace through strength, coming through. I don't want to give Trump too much credit, but is there a way where he can thread the needle and have both?
Mhm.
Uh, can
Mhm.
there be a consistent position where he looks more nativist, talking about economic nationalism, and wouldn't work well for our allies, but then peace through strength, he pushes allies to all do more, whether it's through
Sure,
minilaterals or
sure.
bilateral alliances. But that will be very hard to thread because even if you look at South Korea, they want to be a good alliance partner too, but if they're getting slapped with 10, 20% tariffs and they're losing money, it doesn't make South Korea that willing. I'm not sure if Yoon would be as keen to work with the US. And that's where I wonder if China has an opening to try to pick off some of that. The allies become upset with US policy because of economic nationalism. Just if Xi Jinping decides to do a charm offensive and reach out, that might be a problem. But something to look for is economic nationalism versus hegemonic militarism.
Outside of the US, there is a perception that despite political bipolarization in the United States, there is consensus of view about China between two parties or inside a party. President Trump is selecting the high-ranking foreign policy officials based on the loyalty to, but that doesn't mean that loyalty will guarantee a coherent perspective on China among the officials. There might be some different views, like in the first term, there was a so-called the group of adults in the White House.
Mhm.
So, could there be any balancing political forces inside the executive or from the Congress that will drive Trump into a more rational way of making foreign policy? So, selection of the officials will be important, do you think?
Yes, who has Trump's ear will be very important. The first day or so when, Senator Marco Rubio was tapped to be the Secretary of State, people were actually happy because he's a hawk, but he's respected all among
I see.
Republican colleagues and has experience. He's served on, the Foreign Affairs Committee. And for those who follow North Korea, he's championed North Korean human rights. He's a Cuban immigrant himself. He has this anti-communist view that shapes his anti, China, anti-North Korea position. And it was the same for Representative Waltz as for National Security Advisor. They have experience respected by colleagues. For Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, a Fox News personality,
Right.
he has real experience on the strategic front. I mean, he served in the U.S. Army as a junior officer, but that doesn't really give you the strategic picture
Right.
to
Right.
make decisions. That's what's troubling. That's the rumor with Hegseth. Trump thought there were insiders, some cabinet officials that stonewalled him, tried to prevent him from implementing what he really wanted to do. To
See.
avoid that, he's now picking loyalists who may not necessarily have experience, committed views. That could be a problem. There aren't any guardrails. There isn't any way to restrain him if he makes decisions really undermine not only U.S. national interests, but really global or regional security. So yes, we do have to look very closely to see who fills that cabinet position. But I do want to remind everyone that just because Trump appoints people doesn't mean that they're approved. Now, some positions, like the national security advisor, doesn't require confirmation, so that would be a concern.
That's very helpful in understanding what's happening at the early stage of the selection of the important people.